We have a technical break. End of technical break. Dear colleagues, let me declare open the session of the Dissertation Council for the defense of Thesis by Urper Mehmet for the degree of Candidate of Political Sciences, Specialty 230004, Political Problems of International Relations, Global and Regional Development. On the following subject: UK policy on regional and ethno-confessional elites in modern Iraq. According to the orders in Petersburg University of April 22, 2019, number 4181/1, me, Yakov Nikolai Nikolaevich, at your service, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of the Department of Middle East History, St. Petersburg University, was appointed Chairman of this Dissertation Council. And let me introduce my fellow Council members. Tumanyan Tigran Gurgenovich, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies of the East, St. Petersburg University. Litvak Nikolai Vitalyevich, Doctor of Sociology, Moscow State Institute of International Relations, University, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Kivanch Ulusoy, Doctor of History, Istanbul University, Turkey. Unfortunately, Tanyar Saidovich Yagya, Doctor of History, Professor of Department of World Politics at Pittsburgh University, will not be able to attend our meeting today because of his illness. First, let me emphasize that according to the federal law of the 23rd of August 1996, number 127 FZ on science and the state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg University has the right to award academic degrees independently. The corresponding order on the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, on the basis of which we are holding this session of the Council, was issued on the 1st of September 2016, number 6021/1. You can look it up. In accordance with this order, a session of the Dissertation Council is duly constituted if at least 2/3 of the approved members of the board are participating, but not less than 4 persons. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 members. 4 members are present. Thus, there is a quorum. Let me set forth the procedure of today's session of the Dissertation Council with a total duration of no more than 2 hours. First, a chairman's brief report on the main contents of the documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the requirements. Answers to possible questions, 5 minutes. Item 2, brief presentation by the degree applicant outlining the key points of his study, 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant strictly on his report, No more than 2 minutes per question. Answers of the applicant. Speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews, with their statement of their positions, questions and suggestions to the applicant. No more than 10 minutes for each speaker. Speech of the chairman with his review. Answers of the applicant to questions and remarks of members of the Dissertation Council. No more than 15 minutes. Open discussion. Speeches of the attendees with a summary of their positions and or specific questions and suggestions to the applicant strictly on the topic of the study. Not more than 5 minutes per person. To do that, all the speakers are kindly requested to put their names on the registration sheet and fully introduce themselves before speaking. Final answers of the applicant to the questions asked, no more than 5 minutes. Speech of the scientific supervisor, no more than 3 minutes. 5-minute discussion before the open voting on awarding or not awarding the academic degree to the applicant. For the time of this discussion of the council members, the broadcasting shall be suspended. Open individual voting. The chairman of the Dissertation Council shall count the votes, and the results shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Item 12, a decision on awarding or not awarding the degree to the applicant. Item 13, closing remarks of the applicant. No more than 2 minutes. Before starting the official procedure, let me remind you to switch off the mobile phones. Please check again or turn the sound off. Thank you for your understanding. Let me also inform you that our meeting shall be recorded on broadcast online at the university website, and the speeches shall be simultaneously translated from Russian into English or from English into Russian as appropriate. So I shall now begin the meeting, and with our first item, the chairman's summary report. Summary report of the chairman. On the content of the documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the applicable requirements and answers to possible questions. So this item is complete. A brief presentation of the applicant outlining the main the applicant submitted the following documents: an application to the rector of St. Petersburg University, Professor Nikolai Kropotchev. The application is enclosed on admission to review and defense of the thesis dated 29th of November 2018, a review by Nikolai Dobronravin, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of World Politics at St. Petersburg University. A list of 3 publications outlining the main scientific findings of the thesis. All the papers have been published in the peer-reviewed scientific periodicals from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. A certificate on passing the candidates' exams dated 7th of July 2018, number 048238, issued by St. Petersburg University, that the applicant Urper Mehmet has passed the candidates' exams, specialty 230004, Political Problems of International Relations, Global and Regional Development. History and Philosophy of Science, Political Sciences, English Language, and Political Problems of International Relations, Global and Regional Development. All 3 exams with excellent marks. A diploma on completing the postgraduate course, AS number 00319 in International Relations and World Politics, issued by St. Petersburg University on the 14th of July, 2018. The thesis in Russian and in English in hard copy on the rights of manuscripts and in the electronic form. The thesis has been formatted in accordance with the state standard R7.0, which means printed on a multiplier device with indication of the output data according to the state standard R7.0.4. It should be noted that all the above listed documents comply with Article 12, Section 3, thesis, presentation and defense of the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. Appendix number 1 to the order. Okay, now we shall proceed to the brief presentation of the applicant. The floor is yours, Mehmet. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear members of the Dissertation Council and dear guests. The topic of this dissertation is the UK policy on regional and ethno-confessional elites in modern Iraq. The relevance of the topic has both practical and theoretical aspects. Diplomatic and political activities of subjects of the international law in the modern world continues to remain high and thus gets new nuances connected with continuing information revolution. Interstate relations are becoming as public as possible and require new ways of covering them. The relevance of the topic is determined by the role of UK as one of the leading players in relations with the Middle East in general and Iraq in particular. The countries of Middle East are of key importance in the current geopolitical situation. UK policy in modern Iraq can serve as a suitable example to consider specific actions of global policy actors to restructure the system of relations between local, regional and global actors in the Middle East. The object of my research is the policy of Great Britain in Iraq at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st centuries. The subject of my research is official and unofficial relations of regional elites of Iraq with Great Britain in relation to ethno-confessional groups within the framework of political and diplomatic activity. The source base of the study contains materials from the British government and the House of Commons, documents of the British Foreign Office, UN documents on the Middle East settlement, and documents of the League of Arab States, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, memories and memoirs of the staff of diplomatic agencies and international organizations, which, in addition to subjective information, contain a certain amount of verified data on the development in the region. Transcripts of public speeches and reports of politicians from the National Archives of Great Britain. In terms of degree of maturity, there is currently a significant body of research directly or indirectly related to the subject matter of my thesis. However, in terms of British policy towards regional and ethno-confessional leads in modern Iraq, the problem has not yet been comprehensively addressed. The chronological framework of this study, my study, covers the period between 1991, the starting point of British foreign policy in the region, the first operation in the Persian Gulf, to mid-2010s. The main purpose of my work is to identify the common trends in policy and interaction between the UK and ethno-confessional and regional elites in modern Iraq. To achieve this goal, the following objects have been identified: to present the main stages of evolution of relations between Great Britain and Iraq, to analyze their current state in the cultural, historical, and historical-political contexts, to identify the main trends in the political and ethno-confessional situation in modern Iraq, for a better understanding of the ways of interaction between Great Britain and the government and public opinion of Iraq. Third task was to consider the main logic of the British diplomatic service at certain stages of the actual development of modern Iraq, its priority goals and objectives, to analyze the non-democratic actions of Great Britain with the aim of building a consistent model of the United Kingdom's behavior in relation to Iraq, taking into account the military, economic, and other interests, as well as the interests of other major players in the region. And the objective was to give a detailed description of the situation of the Kurdish nation in modern Iraq, its own goals and objectives, as well as the goals and objectives of British policy in relation to the Iraqi Kurdistan. The theoretical basis of this study was the work of representatives of the liberal and realistic paradigm of research in the field of international relations, such as Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye, Kenneth Waltz, and other researchers who consider the role of international organizations as key in modern international relations and world politics. The methodological basis was made up of such general scientific methods as analysis and synthesis, induction, deduction, comparison, and analogy, progress from concrete facts to abstract generalization, as well as system analysis as a political science research method. The work uses a dialectical approach to the history of international relations, principles of historicism, and scientific objectivity. Among the special scientific methods, we use historical genetic and historical comparative methods. Novelty of the work lies in the fact that in the first time it considers ethnic and religious associations with Iraq in general, in the framework of the relationship with the UK. It also makes a forecast of the long-term relationships of modern Great Britain with the religious groups in Iraq. The paper suggests a variant of building a model of British foreign policy behavior. The theoretical significance of my research lies in the fact made on the basis of the representative material, create a comprehensive view of the goals and objectives of the British political forces on the territory of modern Iraq. They enrich knowledge about the international environment of world politics, contribute to a deeper understanding of specific implementation of political in a large modern state. The practical significance of the study is in the fact that its results can be used in the process of modeling the British behavior in the Middle East region, and also in the development of concepts of foreign policy of states having interests in the territory of modern Iraq. The materials can be used in teaching, as well as a practical guide and a collection of factual materials summarizing the ideas about the British policy in Iraq. The structure of my thesis. The paper contains an introduction, 3 chapters, and a conclusion. In Chapter 1, we analyze the Iraqi policy of Great Britain in the period from the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the collapse of Saddam Hussein regime. Special attention is paid to the problem of Iraqi Kurdistan. The results show that the British policy in Iraq was marked by historical inconsistency and ignorance of the opinions of the local elites. Among the important conclusions are the following. On the example of Iraqi Kurdistan in the second half of the 20th century in Iraq, it can be noted that the British policy was dictated in many respects by the idea of the existence of an absolute good applicable to all the international actors without exception. At the same time, Iraqi Kurdistan served as a kind of field for socio-political experiments of the British administration. For example, the Kurds of the pre-mandate period are characterized by researchers as a conglomerate of tribal formations led by the tribal elite and the so-called Agami. This formation, which assumes linguistic and an ethnic community, nevertheless was at the pre-national stage of self-awareness. Nevertheless, immediately after the end of World War I, the concept of a united Kurdish nation was developed by the victorious members of the Entente, but not by the people themselves. The British declared their intention to create a free southern Kurdistan under British supervision, but on the ground, this intention was transformed into a desire to include the Kurds into the British world system, while categorically ignoring their opinions and intentions of the people. Ignoring the opinions of the population has reached the point of outright disregard for the interests of the people. It became more important for the UK to maintain stability in Iraq and to establish contacts with Turkey. The similar attitude to the problem of modern Iraq was demonstrated by Tony Blair's office in accordance with his neoliberal concept. Mr. Blair achieved the overthrow of the existing regime with the aim of establishing a just society and entering the international arena. Thus, the policy of modern Great Britain demonstrates an approach that shows the former imperial mentality towards less developed territories, which continue to be used for political and social transformations beyond the will of the local population. Chapters 2 and 3 show that similar strategies shape the British policy in Iraq today. On the one hand, it's possible to see the historical continuity in this, but on the other, the lack of flexibility of policy in its implementation, lack of adaptability to the new realities of international relations when the modern processes of globalization forced to take into account the interests of the regional actors, including ethno-confessional groups. Our research shows to draw the following conclusions. First of all, British policy in the Middle East is, in general, and Iraq in particular, either follows the real concept of political neorealism or turns out to be unsuccessful. Neoliberalism is present theoretically, but in its practical implementation, the British policy is drastically ineffective. Thus, the Middle East policy of UK suffered serious damage during the periods of its fascination with ideal constructions, which can be traced from the Sykes-Picot Treaty, with its borders drawn along the line, and interwar projects of building a Kurdish state by the efforts of the outside, to the times of application of the doctrine of international community, for the sake of which the UK was forced to go direct violation of UN decisions. Second, more flexible concepts, such as the idea of networking, provide to be maximally resilient and harmless in the Middle East policy of the UK, but not due to their merits, but only due to their more realistic and less imperative nature, which allows the soothing the corners of foreign policy and going beyond the original framework of the concept. The most useful version of the foreign policy concept is neorealism, which consists in the absence of strict rules of interaction between the states. Secondly, the declared and real policy of London towards Iraq is still seriously different. The UK Foreign Office is unable to cope with the multifactorial set of challenges in the troubled region, which affects the overall security and success of the UK actions in modern Iraq. Fourth, the UK is developing bilateral relations with the Iraqi Kurdistan region in addition to the central Baghdad government, but at the same time is not consistently building relations with the regional elites, pushing them away from their diplomatic attitude to autonomy or independence of the Kurdish people. In general, it's difficult to predict the development of the Iraqi-British relationship, but a number of necessary factors can be identified that may determine the process or failure of the British policy in Iraq in the near future. First is the ability to limit Iran's influence on the Iraq Shiite community. The second factor is the desire to build a Kurdish-British dialogue on mutually beneficial terms while ensuring equal partnership and cooperation. The third factor is the ability to ensure and reinforce influence and credibility of the partnership between Erbil and Baghdad. The fourth factor is mediation in normalizing Iraq's relations with the most influential countries in the region. The fifth factor is the application of foreign policy doctrines that are not based on idealistic structures, but contain strict imperatives instead of presumptive recommendations. The last factor is the formation of a comprehensive strategy for strengthening the influence in the region, taking into account not only the diplomatic but also the economic, humanitarian, cultural actions to strengthen UK's authority in the Middle East, including among various elites in the region. Thus, the theoretical conclusions and practical recommendations obtained are confirmed by the material analysis and, in the long run, may serve as a basis for the analysis of further actions of the UK, both in Iran and in neighboring countries. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Does anyone have questions to the applicant? Let me remind you that we have only 2 minutes for each question. Please introduce yourself. Good afternoon. Associate Professor of St. Petersburg University. Here's my question. As you know, in recent years, there's been a dramatic decline for Erdogan party in Turkey. And in connection with this, let me ask you the following question. What do you think? In the current situation, how will the relations between Turkey and Kurdistan in Iraq develop, and how will the UK policy affect these relations? Will there be will it influence the relationship? Thank you for your question. Generally speaking, if we look at the relationship between Iraqi and Baghdad and political role of the UK, we may also refer that back in 1920s, at the time of King Faisal, and the situation is very similar today. Everything will depend on if the Kurds are ready to move forward against Baghdad and Turkey. Turkey is ready to stay away from developing relations with Baghdad because during the referendum, Turkey defined its position as negative. Generally speaking, this is the official position of the country, and in reality, Turkey wanted Kurdish autonomy to get stronger against Baghdad. Well, maybe if Baghdad gets under the control of Tehran, and in our recommendations, if Iran can, if the UK can loosen the ties between Turkey but if the UK is not successful and cannot loosen the ties between Baghdad and Tehran, then Turkey will have to establish good relationship with Baghdad. So the relationship will depend on this triangle, on the three nations, and the Kurdish or the autonomous quasi-state. It's a kind of a quasi-state. Thank you. Are you satisfied with the answer? Yes, partly. I'm partly satisfied. Does anyone else have questions? If we have no questions, please have a seat, and let's hear the reviews, including the external ones. We have external reviews submitted by Iqbal Dure, Saad Javad, Jan Campbell, and Mr. Filipov. All the reviews were timely, as required by paragraph 19 of the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, Annex 1 to the order, posted on the official university website. Let's hear the reviews. If no one has any objections, let me read out a review by Iqbal Dure of Moscow State Linguistic University. You don't have to read. We'll pay more attention to the critical part, to the criticism. The review starts by saying that the thesis is an attempt at a systematic scientific review of the British policy in Iraq and the Kurdistan region from the 1990s to the present day. It uses a fairly wide range of foreign sources, despite the fact that there is very little material available on this topic. However, in general, the characteristic is positive. It's the reviewer says comments on conclusions in the end of the thesis, and in addition to that, he pays attention to some issues, as Mr. Iqbal Dure says in his thesis. The author exaggerated the political, economic, and other capabilities of Iraqi Kurdistan by sometimes idealizing the actions of the leadership. The thesis asserts that the regional government has a carefully planned foreign policy, skillfully built international relations, and clearly pursued national interests. With page 173. With all due respect for the author's feelings, this conclusion is incompatible with the real state of affairs, says the reviewer. Also, in his opinion, the role of Iraqi Kurdistan representative officers in other countries is exaggerated. For example, the author writes that in some countries, for example, in the UK and the US, representatives of the Kurdistan government achieved much greater success than their colleagues from the embassy of Iraq. Says page 169. I would like to ask what these successes were exactly, and what were their results, especially in the context of the referendum. Periodically, it seems that the author forgets the simple principle that states have no friends but only interests, and therefore criticizes the actions of UK and US in the Kurdistan region, as if expecting them to become more Kurds than the Kurds themselves. Second comment. The paper describes in detail the inter-party differences in Iraqi Kurdistan, but does not suggest a solution to these issues. This can be explained by the fact that the author of the thesis did not have such a task. But it's necessary to admit that this state of affairs in Iraqi Kurdistan will actually continue, as the Kurdish parties have not learned the necessary lessons from the history of the region. It was necessary to explain how the policy of UK and other countries could influence the internal Kurdish disagreements. Third comment, the thesis doesn't say anything about the idea of large Middle East project. To what extent does this project coincide or does not coincide with the main directions of the British policy in the region? Or is this project only a myth? Asks the reviewer. Question 4. I don't think it's realistic to use the result of this research to model the British behavior in the Middle East region in general. Page 12 of the thesis. In his opinion, the author's emotional assessment in the conclusions, which is understandable. Despite these remarks, Mehmet Urper's dissertation, UK policy on regional and ethno-confessional leaks in modern Iraq, can be regarded as a relevant and worthy work in the field of political research. The main provisions and conclusions of the thesis are substantiated and reflected in 3 publications of the author, including 3 publications including in the list approved by the Higher Attestation Commission of the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. Thus, the thesis is a scientific work that meets the requirements for thesis under the order of St. Petersburg University, approved by the government of the Russian Federation of the 1st of September 2016. number 6821/1 on the procedure for awarding the academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and its author deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Political Sciences in specialty 2300, Political Problems of International Relations, Global and Regional Development. Says the reviewer. Would the applicant like to answer the comments, the critical comments? First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Iqbal for his analysis and review. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being visiting the meeting today. I am very grateful. Also, I'd like to say that dear Mr. Iqbal says that exaggeration of the activities in my thesis is somewhat subject. The analysis is of Kurdish policy is subjective, yet the materials I use based on documents, which makes our approach objective. The thesis describes many issues, many problems, such as lack of democratization and others. And as for the successes of the Kurdish government abroad, they are actively establishing cultural, commercial and social relations. The reviewer comments on the lack of practical recommendations on dealing with the Kurdistan issue, but identifying the reasons of the disagreement was not the aim of this work. Yet, of course, the policy of UK is closely connected with the Kurdish disagreement, conflict. Also, in the review, I'd say the reviewer mentions, says it's impossible to use the results of this research to model the British behavior in the region. But let me object that the results can be obtained by analyzing representative empirical material, which helped us to create a realistic picture. Thank you for your review. Thank you. The next external review was submitted by Mr. Saad Javad, a professor of political sciences of London School of Economics of London University. And while the review is generally favorable, contains favorable assessment of the thesis, and contains a conclusion, and there's a conclusion in the end. And the comments are as follows.
Candidate, but on the Russian universities, is the lack of Arabic and Kurdish documents and sources. But this is, in fact, cannot be little the good and insightful work done by the candidate. I can fairly conclude that the thesis entitled Policy of the United Kingdom towards regional and ethno-confessional allies in modern-day Iraq, prepared by Urper Mehmet, deserves to be awarded the degree of PhD in political science.
This is the only critical comment. And this critical comment is, there is not enough documents in Arabic and Kurdish language. May I comment may I comment on this review later, together with commenting on the other reviews. The next review submitted by Mr. Jan Campbell. If you can read the review. Dr. Campbell of Higher School of International Relations of the Czech Council, a member of Informal Economic Forum, International Committee for Peace. The review is generally favorable, and the reviewer notes a high level of the thesis. Some comments here. The understanding universalism is something cannot be structurally specific, and on the other hand, nothing can be qualified as absence of existence, and so we are dealing with absolute nothing. And let me give you an example. A butterfly. This is a being which can only be described, but cannot be created. Why is unity is only to be found in unity? Plants are different, are linked by one. So the author made himself well familiar with these comments, which are more of a philosophical nature, and in general, to sum it up in his review, Mr. Campbell says that on the basis of the above mentioned, including remarks, it's possible to draw a conclusion that the author of the thesis presented the high-quality work connected with actual problems of the world, with the finished, independently spent research on scientific levels with significant theoretical and practical value. Even if the requirements to the content of the thesis differ depending on the country of study, degree, and scientific direction, the general requirements, which are originality, uniqueness, independence in preparation, availability of officially published publications on the topic of the thesis, and requirements for the degree of candidate of political science in the EU standards are fulfilled. And the thesis by Mehmet Urpers, British UK policy on regional ethno-confessional elites in modern Iraq, corresponds to the requirements of the requirements established by the order, or the number on the order of awarding the degree at St. Petersburg University, and the applicant deserves being awarded the degree of candidate of political sciences, 230004, political problems of international relations, global and regional development. So this is a review by Dr. Jan Campbell. Thank you. Can I speak from my seat? And please use the microphone. Thank you very much for coming, Dr. Campbell, for being our guest today. I appreciate you being here very much. Thank you for your review. This is a very good review, very detailed review, and the philosophical images of my ideas. I'm absolutely positive that not everyone can take such a deep look into the core. As for your critical comments, I would say that your comments are more or less the same in every review. That is why I wanted to answer all the comments in the end, which was my original plan. If the Dissertation Council has no objections to that, do we have any objections? No, we don't. Thank you. Thank you. We have one more external review submitted by Deputy Director of Institute of State Academy of Management of the President of Republic of Belarus. The review is, in generally speaking, favorable. The author comments on relevance, independence, logical structure, and at that, Mr. Filipov mentions the following. Which can be improved. The need for following recommendations can be made to improve the work. Need for thorough drafting, editing of the text, taking account norms of the modern Russian language, spelling names in accordance with the established practice in Russian speaking historiography, wider use of Arabic and Kurdish documents. The review was prepared by Alexander Anatolovich Filipov, Deputy Director of the Institute of Public Administration of the Academy of Public Administration under the President of the Republic of Belarus, candidate of Political Sciences. Can you answer any of these comments, please? Mr. Filipov, thank you for your review. I would like to meet Mr. Filipov, but unfortunately this turned out to be impossible. As for his comments, let me say about the spelling of personal names in Russian. In Russian language uses Latin and French transcription, and there's no Russian standard, so this is very difficult because Russian is not my native language, of course, and secondly, I tried to rely on the original language of each document and use the same spelling in Russian. As for the lack of Arabic and Kurdish sources, I tried to use documents in Kurdish and Turkish languages, which were accessible to me, and I don't speak any Arabic languages, which of course is a disadvantage, but maybe in the future I will improve my command of the Arabic languages. Thank you. We are ready now to hear the reviews of the members of the Dissertation Council, and let's start with the review by Tigran Tumanyan. Dear colleagues, thank you for inviting me and for inviting me to take part in the any discussion of Iraq issues. Interests me. My first thesis about 25 years ago at St. Petersburg University was on the UK policy and emergence of the state of Iraq. My academic supervisor was Dr. Dyakov. That was a long time ago, and any research connected with this country, which I love after having spent a number of years there, and with which I am very familiar. And today's meeting is very interesting for me. I enjoyed reading your thesis. I wouldn't say I have a universal opinion, and not to produce more questions and misunderstanding, I will now read the review. The role of UK in modern history of Arabic countries, the interests of British Empire became basis of territorial, and the UK won the war, became the main architect of the new political order in the Middle East, and it took and played a major role in establishing the new state. And when the state of Iraq was proclaimed, well, then Iraq, in its modern borders, was formed. The official London received for many years not only a convenient link in the strategic chain of its colonial system, but also a reliable supply of energy sources. At the same time, Iraq, designed according to the British plan, received, along with solid territorial acquisitions, vilayets of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, intractable problems of national and confessional nature. The vilayets of former Ottoman Empire, which differed from both ethnically and religiously, were hastily united into a single state, had to prove their historical compatibility under the conditions of constant political turbulence. Numerous ethnic and confessional issues, as well as border territorial disputes, the legacy of the British colonial policy, accompanied the development of the Iraqi state throughout the 20th century, and they have not been resolved today. At the same time, it's obvious that any attempt to cardinally resolve these complex issues can and will surely threaten stability and security in the Middle East. That is why the issues of studying the political development of the Iraqi state, which as a rule are connected with ethnic and religious aspects, usually have a high degree of urgency. In this connection, the thesis titled "The UK Policy and Regional Ethno-Confessional Elites in Modern Iraq" cannot be irrelevant. The work presented here is based has 3 chapters: introduction and a conclusion. The first chapter, which considers a good half of the thesis, is the chapter 1. Is the basis of your research, is the most substantial part of your research. Chapter 1 is devoted to the political evolution of relations between UK and Iraq. In this section of the study, the author addresses the main stages of development of the state of Iraq in the context of its relations with the UK. Despite the chronological framework of the thesis, between 1991 and mid-2010s, in the first chapter, the author tries to develop a historical panorama of the formation and evolution of the Iraqi state, from the period of the British Mandate to the events of the Arab Spring. This was my understanding. Such a large scale of the problem looks quite relevant and even beneficial in some ways, together with referring to different stages of the central history of Iraqi state. Also proposes a proper possession of scientific material, sources and literature. Unfortunately, after studying the text, didn't get this impression, and well, you don't get this feeling. For example, looking at the early mandate, the early monarchy period, when the role of the UK in formation of the Arabic state was more than prominent. Well, the author refers to not the most important scientific literature, and which is particularly striking, the author ignores what has been written by prominent scientists on this subject. which was already mentioned by my colleague from London, the source base. What is surprising is the absence or ignorance of the main scientific works on the social and political history of Iraq in the 20th century, which no serious study can be without. So it's sufficient to say that the works of such authors such as Stephen Longrig, Iraq 1990-1950s, Ernst Mayne, Iraq from Mandate to Independence, Edmonds, so quite unusual to Kurds, Turks and Arabs travel and research in northeastern Iraq. Philip Ireland, Iraq, a study in political development. Majid Khadouri is a classical author who wrote many books on Iraq, and you never mention any of them. At least one work, Independent Iraq, Socialist Iraq. Peter Sluglet, Britain in Iraq, classical work. Daniel Silverfarb, Britain's Informal Empire in the Middle East. And many other works are not mentioned by have not been mentioned by the author. Though, let me repeat myself, there's no single serious piece of research in the world is written. However, what is even more bewildering is the absence of monumental study entitled The Old Social Classes and Revolutionary Movement of Iraq by a recognized expert in the field of social and political history of Iraq, Hana Batato. This work is almost 2,000 pages long, of wonderful text. It's a wonderful book based on Iraqi sources, published many years ago. Yet until the present, it still stands out. And in this fundamental work, the formation of the political league of the state is the thesis is called a policy on regional and ethno-confessional elites in modern Iraq. So Hana Batato will be very instrumental. It deals with role and place in the life of the country. Not being familiar with this work significantly impoverishes the content and the quality of the thesis. The list of national literature is also quite strange. The research doesn't show any signs of being familiar with the most significant works of Soviet and Russian experts, in Iraq, such as Mentashashvili, Kotlov, Mirsky, Zhigalin, a prominent expert. The only really large specialist in Iraq, Fedchenko, whose work is mentioned, is mistakenly named Fedorchenko or something. Well, he was mentioned. So one can only guess why the applicant ignores numerous extremely useful and substantial publications of such respected experts on Kurds and Kurdish issue as Lazarev and Shamkrom Goy, recognized, who written many wonderful books on the Kurdish issue problem. So he authored dozens of books. Probably those omissions are the reason why the text of the dissertation reveals numerous mistakes and shortcomings. It makes no sense to give their full list. Let me name some of them. For example, on page 40 of the thesis, the author speaks of a certain Henry Dodds, the High Commissioner of UK in Iraq. However, it's well known that a famous British diplomat and colonial officer who preceded Sir Clayton was called Henry Dobbs. He's not Dodds. In some languages, this is a bad word. Next page 41, there's one more mistake. After the end of the Mandela London continued to exercise military political control of the military political regime it created. It's difficult to understand what the applicant means, given the well-known fact that in 1930s signed not only Anglo-Iraqi treaty, which has suggested and even supported the prospect of Iraq's entry into the League of Nations. As for the British mandate in Iraq, It was officially abolished only in 1932, and it was after that, in the words of the thesis, London continued to exercise military and political control over the political and military control of the creation of a Hashemite kingdom of Iraq, according to the Treaty of 1930. So these are two different things. The Arabic state of Iraq was the first Arabic state which entered the League of Nations, and then was the sole representative of the interests of the Arab world. It would be interesting to know what the author means by citing from a small and low original article, forgetting to mention the name of the magazine and exact page of the text, the following words. For Great Britain, Mesopotamia and Iraq in particular had a strategic importance. So that will be very interesting. What is Mesopotamia and what is Iraq? Why such division? Why are you making such? Surprising by the spelling of names and surnames of famous foreign politicians of the 20th century, such as Lloyd George and Hugh Tant, but these are minor things. This is not far from exhaustive, the mistakes made by the applicant. At the same time, it's necessary to comment a section of the chapter devoted to the structure of Kurdish national movement in Iraq, where little known material is presented, and peculiarities of the development of the relations between the political elite of the Kurds and the authorities in Baghdad. Some other aspects of the thesis, first of all, concerning peculiarities of social and political development of Iraqi Kurdistan, also look advantageous. Have no critical remarks here. It's obvious that the author is well familiar with these issues rather than the general context. Chapter 2, Great Britain, Modern Iraq, the author briefly focuses on the nature of the policy of the UK in Iraq. In the same chapter, also deals with peculiarities of Iraq's political relations with its neighbors in the region, as well as the Russian Federation. The third chapter of the dissertation is entitled The British Policy Towards the Kurdish Autonomous Region. This section of the thesis deserves more positive assessment. It demonstrates good understanding of the processes that have taken place in the political life of Iraqi Kurdistan in the last 20-25 years. The conclusion summarizes findings of the applicant. In general, after reading the thesis, I got a number of questions. The structure of the thesis, in my opinion, does not look very good. We can only guess why the author breaks the paragraphs into small subsections. Sometimes 31 of them, which do not have proper meaning and logical connection, and sometimes consist of only a half of 2 pages. What's the point in breaking the text into these small fragments? Selection and use of sources and literature raises serious questions. The author ignores important source material, often refers to little known. This is really surprising. Well, why refer to an abstract? You mentioned my abstract, but I think it would be useful for you to read my thesis. An abstract is not is only a summary. It doesn't give any information. On the other hand, Public Record Office, the main archive in which all the original documentation related to UK foreign policy is stored. Any serious researcher seeks to work with the PRO archives. This information Klondike, the use of which is usually dooms you to success in research. This is the main archive on the British external policy, and it's a wonderful archive which consists of 2 archives, a Colonial Office and Foreign Office, and I'm very well familiar with this archive. You mentioned it a couple of times, but if you are familiar with the archive, why you did not use it enough. This is the best source of information available. It's also surprising that in the thesis, where one of the main issues of study is the Iraqi ethnic and religious elite, as well as the regional elites in the context of British Middle East policy, in fact, there's no full reference to this issue. The text of the dissertation is mainly built around the Kurds and the Kurdish problem. At the same time, the problem in the title, this is much wider. We talk regional, ethno-confessional. It will be interesting to find out what you mean by regional elites. Will paying tribute to the attempt to cover the stages of political history of the Iraqi state, the international influence on modern processes. Necessary to point out the absence of appropriate research, reaction to the events of the Iran-Iraqi war and the invasion of the Iraq into Kuwait. At the same time, the coverage of these events in the context of British interests and policies in the Middle East could look original and interesting. We are not very well familiar with the reaction, UK reaction to Iran-Iraqi war. Yet this war involved the Kurdish elite, the Kurdish community as well. What is even more strange is absence of proper analysis of UK policies of the Storm in the Desert war, because this war became a turning point in the new political reality in the region in general. It's regrettable. I regret to say that the study contains many errors and inaccuracies, both of substantial and technical nature, especially in the first chapter. The author quotes forgetting to make references to the sources. All the above indicates that we are facing a formally completed thesis which is in need of some improvement in terms of redistribution of research emphasis, improving written and scientific culture. It can be said that the goal of the research has been partly achieved, although the level of execution of the thesis remains, it is much to be desired. The nature of mistakes and defects is not so much a sound degree trained young researcher, whom I have met before, and I understand that he is quite well familiar with this subject. Let me repeat. The nature of mistakes do not denote not the poor training of a young researcher who is not a native speaker, but qualification and quality work of an academic supervisor who has taken on the work of helping and guiding the thesis on Iraq and Middle East. That is why when I have to assess the thesis, give positive and negative assessment, and considering independent effort of the applicant to achieve his goal, I support the positive solution. The thesis of Urper Mehmet on UK policy and regional ethno-confessional elites in modern Iraq meets the main requirements set forth by the order of the 1st of September 2016, 6821/1 on the order awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the applicant deserves being awarded the degree of candidate of political sciences, specialty 230004, political problems of international relations, global and regional development. Clause 11 of the above-mentioned order has not been violated. Thank you for your attention. Let's stick to the time frame. Thank you for your review and for your detailed analysis. And with your review, I feel that this was very this review was made from the start. And Dr. Tumanyan spent a long time reading my review and took a long time to analyze, maybe because I'm not a native speaker of Russian. there are some mistakes in my work, and I certainly need your advice. Thank you for your advice. And as for your comments, let me say, Dr. Tumanyan mentions comments on not using most important sources on social and political history of Iraq, such as Hanna Batatu, Stefan Longrid, Ernest Mani, Metashashvili, Katlov, and others. I have to admit that the scope of St. Literature is not complete. However, it seemed to me important to introduce into the Russian scientific circulation the sources that are used, rather than repeat what has already been said in my work. The novels and specialty passport rules is especially important. The sources in which the history of political relations in the region, rather actual problems, international, global, and regional development was written, had to be excluded as much as possible after 1990s in the Middle East. I understand that between history and political sciences has some links, but these are two different fields of study also in the Turkish tradition, and the same is true in Turkey. Moreover, the strategic importance of Mesopotamia for UK women, that the region of Mesopotamia, with its good trade location and oil and gas wealth, is of strategic importance in the Middle East. The region between the two rivers and neighboring states bordering on the region. As for the width of the problem, I can explain that the Kurdish question was in the center of my attention because ethnic and religious problems are closely connected with the problems of the Kurds and the problem of the British policy in relation to the regional and ethnic confessional elites in the most complete and consistent ways refers to the Kurdistan, the well-defined political and economical region of Iraq on the basis of ethno-confessional features. From the point of view of international relations and political science, it was important for us to consider the policy of a foreign state, in our case Britain, in relation not to another state, but to a whole region of another state, which is important from the point of view of regional and ethno-confessional split within a state of Iraq, which Stein Rocken called cleavage. In this regard, we are indeed superficial addressing the Iraqi invasion in Kuwait and the Desert in the Storm operation, as these developments are not as deeply related to the ethno-confessional issues. So this is the end. Thank you. Please have a seat. Next, let us give the floor to Nikolai Litvak and his review. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Many things already mentioned today. I will reiterate. and I would like to make some comments which just occurred to me right now. I represent Moscow Institute for Foreign Relations. I teach at the Department of Philosophy, and in my review I commented on the approaches of the applicant and his attempt to look at the relations between UK attitude to the Kurdish community in Iraq and the neighboring countries. I'd like to say that this was a very challenging task, and I would like to support the previous speaker. I was very surprised to read the chronology in the title of the thesis does not coincide with the text, and the criticism we have just heard is very Dr. Tumanyan was very right. If you focused on the issues between 1990 until the present date, and I say so in my review, all the colonial and post-colonial, the 20th century, shouldn't focus so much because there's a big section of your thesis is dedicated and only how these events influenced the last 20 years of Iraqi history, because your thesis is dedicated to the there's so much material on the history of Iraq and Kurdistan. So the from the point of methodology, this could be corrected. You set yourself a starting point, so stick to this starting point, and storm in the desert was necessary. The second issue I'd like to mention, I'll get closer to the second issue is also has to do with sources. Commons mentioned that you did not use enough Arabic sources. I don't know what the Kurds have written about the British policy, because the subject of your thesis is British policy. But as I said in my review, not using the French sources, and in the globalization period, the ceremonies, the procedures have been translated into English, and you may not be familiar with the language, but the French are very concerned about their language. They also write books in English, and since you mentioned the history of British mandate. They fought against Britain, France, and the UK. So not the interesting process where the British opposition did not allow to soften the policy. I'd like to say that at least some French sources look at some key point and how the events were seen from Paris, because the conflict is still in progress. Maybe it's not between UK and France. And next point was mentioned already. You mentioned many times in your thesis that the policy of UK was not successful. They didn't use their possibilities. So I have a key question. So what would be a good policy? In my review, I say that maybe the fact that the British did not settle the conflict, they will still remain in the position of a judge, and whose role is to make peace between the parties. Trade is developing, and on the other hand, together with the US, they are dropping bombs on the region. So what would be the good policy of the UK? And I have got this question many times. I think the British set the conflicts, set the borders. They want this conflict to last forever in the divided nations in Europe, in Middle East, to retain this position as supreme judge. And editing was already mentioned. I said that the text needs some editing. And the final comment I'd like to say, many times you mentioned the role of the US. And in the beginning, when the idea of a Kurdish state first appeared in the 1920s, U.S. interfered, and the Kurdish state has now not been established. And there's no you don't make the conclusion that UK in the Middle East they had to consider U.S. interests and adapting UK interests to the U.S. position, because everybody has to adapt to U.S. policy. For example, Turkey is now on the edge of conflict, and the UK were very successful. And in conclusion to the formal conclusion of my review, I'd like to support my colleagues. British sources and archives would be very useful. It would be very useful, very good to use them. But also, in your defense, I'd like to say that an attempt, you try to introduce new sources, not that well known, and what I already said, the political process, you don't find it in every country. The struggling between the parties, when the two parties are struggling with each other, they criticize external policy, among other, of the acting government. So that will be very interesting how political parties have used this aspect of the foreign policy. And in conclusion, all the comments are of more recommendatory nature and do not reduce a raw positive assessment of the thesis. And in general, the thesis of Urper Mehmet meets the basic requirements established by Order 6821/1 on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And its author, Urper Mehmet, deserves awarding degree of the candidate of political sciences, special 23004, political problems of international relations, global and regional development. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Litvak. Mr. Urper, please answer your comment. I would like to thank Dr. Litvak especially for coming, for giving such detailed analysis of the present state. And indeed, I can say that, of course, I agree with your recommendations, and I will take them into account in my future papers. Thank you, Dr. Litvak. It's hard to call the British policy inconsistent. Maybe in my thesis, there are some inaccuracies in the wording, but what I wanted to say is that maintaining an internal feeding the internal conflict in Iraq was indeed is. So is this policy successful or unsuccessful? in depth for the UK is this policy is very good and successful, and well, the fact that the population in the region and all the experts in the region can see that the policy is successful. This is what they want us to see. This is indeed the UK policy, official UK policy. You mentioned, you say that we did not study enough U.S. influence to make well, the final conclusion of the U.S. influence. It's necessary to study this issue in more detail. So this was not the key point of our study, and in order to say. There's French sources. Speaking of the French sources, yes, I don't speak French. I tried to use as many documents that were available to me and how they correspond with how they agree with the sources that have already been translated into English. If they agree, that's because in history, I tried to stay away from these sources because this history is not exactly my specialty. Speaking of the region and the French mandate was determined by the territory principles, but in Syria. And the UK mandate existed in the territory of Iraq, and of course there was constant competition. But I agree. So what was more important for me is to identify how how these facts are reflected in can affect the present history. Moreover, I didn't try to describe the entire history because of my specialty. I tried to find facts at which what were the relevant constant factors and how they evolved. So thank you again for coming, and thank you for your review. I'm very grateful for your review. Okay, now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Usoy, who represents University of Istanbul. Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being present here and for inviting me for this jury. And my comments will concentrate more on the theoretical side of the thesis. I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist trained particularly in international theory. That's why I cannot judge, at least in total terms, the historical section of the thesis. And from the jury that I understand, their comments show some important lack of information. I think you will have time for the correction of covering that literature that you haven't covered. I'm sure, because in Turkey we are giving some more time for those kind of corrections, etc. I think you should take them very seriously and add the relevant literature. Particularly, Professor mentioned very important works. Some of them I know, and I noticed that they are not mentioned, but at least they should be integrated to the historical section. And I understand your effort that you would like to give a historical perspective which substantiate a theoretical let's say, information, theoretical knowledge for us. And in this way, you underline particularly that the British policy lacks idealism, despite the fact that there is a rhetoric of idealism. And you mentioned that Britain uses the confessional and ethnic divisions within the country for its interest, not for the sake of the country's interest, let alone for the sake of the ethnic and religious groups' interests as well. However, theoretically this is important. I understand from an international relations perspective, it's quite obvious that a country in this international system prioritizes its national interests, and there is only this realist perspective which is prevalent, and you rightly put it in and substantiate it with new theoretical material. But I think it tells us more than this, and you see that the British policy is directed to ethnic and confessional groups separately from the central state in Iraq, which was established in the 1920s. So this means that actually it bypasses the basic rule of international relations. So establishing its relations in respect to the central state. This, as I see, from a democratic theory perspective, detrimental to the establishment of a democratic country. So, as you mentioned, after the coalition's invasion of Iran, and there was a discourse of multiculturalism or creating a multicultural Iraq, etc. And your thesis gives us an interesting clue that that particularly British policy creates or does not help at all to the creation of this multicultural Iraq, neither in the past nor in that in this new period. Because in order to have a properly functioning democratic regime, you need to have a proper state. So when you look at the perspective of international context of democratization, and from a 100-year perspective, which is good, because this is a middle-range theory, but with a larger perspective, you could show us that, because democratization is a long-term perspective, that the British policy has been detrimental to the establishment of a democratic regime in Iraq, because it bypasses and it tries to take as the main interlocutor some subnational ethnic and religious groups, and this is simply eroding the basis of a strong state in Iraq, which is needed for a serious, proper democratic regime. So this is an important thing. So your thesis gives us, from a democratic theory perspective, an important clue, that there is an important role that the international players can play for the establishment of a democratic regime in a country. And Iraq is a disaster in this case, and the British policy plays a role in this case. So this is, I think, you are more dealing with the realist and idealist perspectives, etc., but international context of democratization, which is, I think, a key and might give you some more theoretical flavor to your thesis when you look at it from a long-term perspective. Secondly, my comments will concentrate more on, let's say, the geopolitics of it, pure international relations. You are probably informed about the thesis that the rationality of a state of Iraq is underlined with respect to a pipeline from north to south. So, so if there is a state of Iraq there, it's because there is a pipeline to carry that petroleum from north to the to south. So, so this, I think, this is somehow latent in your thesis, but I think it should be underlined to show the geopolitical significance of establishing a state. It's not for ethical or for, let's say, specific historical conjunctures, etc. I understand your your historical data provides us good examples, but that the geopolitics of it is important, and the energy geopolitics have always been part of this. And my third point is related with again from a theoretical perspective, with the declaration of independence of the northern section of Iraq, let's say, the Kurdish independence. So when you look at from a democratic perspective, this is a complete failure of creating a democratic regime in Iraq, which was never the case probably in the beginning, but later we have heard that this was an aim, but this was not realized. So I think you have to look at that period in an important way. And you will see that, again, from an international context of democratization, one of our professors mentioned the role of Turkey, which said no to the independence of Iraq. But you have to integrate more, I think, from this theoretical perspective, Israel, Iran, the UK, whether they could contribute positively or negatively to an establishment of a proper country there, proper democratic country there. Probably they never wanted that. Not just the UK, but the others either. So I think this might give us that independence section might also give us an important clue in this respect. So I think you have to kind of improve your substantive conclusions in these things. Take a stance and wait some time, and then and just try to integrate your theoretical perspective with a long-term historical perspective. Because at the moment, as far as I see, I did not mention this in our comments, because this is not a tradition in Turkish way of coming to the dissertations. We only say the positive things, not the negative ones. But I think you will have time for this. That you have to think seriously in theoretical terms. Then use more concepts and improve your substantive conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ulusoy Kıvanç, for your very deep and detailed overview. And сейчас мы сообщим.
Now we will read out the review by Dr. Agya, but maybe you can answer Mr. Kıvanç's comments first. Dear member of the council, Professor Kıvanç, I'd like to thank you for taking part in this Dissertation Council and for the detailed analysis of my thesis. Your evaluation is very important as moral support for my future research. Speaking of the role of Israel and Turkey in the Kurdish region, let me answer briefly. It's not always possible to identify practical tasks, even with when analyzing the facts. It's very hard to identify the practical objectives of UK through Israel and Turkey in Iraq. It's hard to prove. And secondly, in our thesis, we didn't set the task to look at Israel as a separate state in the region, and the role of Israel and how they can influence the Kurdish community. We did not describe this in detail. Maybe this is a drawback. Thank you. I will take your comments into account in the future. If you like, I can also answer your comments in English. I think it's easier. Yeah, it's been translated. And a review of member of the Dissertation Council, Professor Vatanyar Saidovich Agya. His review is positive. He's made a few comments, as Dr. Agya says. Well, the thesis has some inaccuracies and grammatical errors. We may say that such grammatical errors are evidence that the author, for whom the Russian language is not his native language but is fluent in it, and wrote the work himself, which also proves his competence in the subject under study. A more substantial comment is about the degree of mastery of archives, pages 5 and 6, the Russian and British. The paper contains a significant number of historical information which overloads the paper, referring to chapter 1. However, if this is important for the author, the details of the history should not be limited to citing publications by other researchers, such as page 16, 17, 20, 31. In addition, there's another problem in the wider use of Arabic and Kurdish documents. Based on the above, we may conclude that the author of the thesis, Mehmet Urper, presented a high-quality work related to a relevant issue of global importance, independently conducted research at a high level with significant theoretical and practical significance, and in general the opinion is positive, and signed by Vatanyar Saidovich Agya, professor of St. Peter's University, head of Department of World Politics. Would you like to answer? Thank you, Dr. Agya, for your review and for agreeing, even though his serious health issues, but he agreed, and he agreed to write such a brilliant review, and he agreed to be a member, to become a member of the Dissertation Council, and I would like to thank Dr. Agya, Professor Agya, for that. And speaking of his comments, generally speaking, as I have already mentioned, the comments are more or less the same. All the comments look similar to me. let me repeat myself. Please excuse me. Dear member of the Dissertation Council and other reviewers, note the need for editing the text, taking into account the norms accepted in the modern Russian literary language. This shortcoming is connected with the fact that the Russian language is not my native language. Acknowledging this, it's necessary to say that I have tried very hard to ensure that the work is as consistent with the norms accepted in the modern literary language. As for the spelling of proper names, as I have already said, I chose spelling based on documents that I used. And since there are different variants of spelling of proper names based on French or Latin transcription, in my thesis I tried to render the names as close to the original spelling as possible. And in connection with this, I'd like to add to sum it up, to answer some other comments. Dear opponents, are very right in saying that it's necessary to use Arabic and Kurdish sources more. I used only those Arabic documents that have been translated into English. I don't speak any Arabic languages. Speaking of the Kurdish documents, I couldn't use them more because they were not available in the archives that to which I had access. Maybe I did not go to the right archives. Maybe I missed some opportunities. And I can say that again, I'd like to thank Dr. Agya for his brilliant review. Thank you very much. Thank you again. And as a chairman of the Dissertation Council, I will summarize my review. Its full review is attached, as was mentioned by Dr. Tumanyan. And I lived in Iraq, so this subject seemed very interesting to me, and the author analyzes history and the present state of life in Iraq, with many problems of internal and external. Of course, well, the choice of a subject, the subject is very relevant. We know the we're all familiar with the current situations, and I'd like to say that the overall conclusions, in my my evaluation is generally positive. Some comments, I would define them as technical. Will be repetitions, can be avoided if chapter 1 did not contain such a detailed description of history and political history of Iraq. As our applicant already mentioned, he doesn't speak Arabic, so that may explain mistakes in transliteration of Arabic names. I will not go into details. Some false evaluations, but of course the applicant has his right. As Islamic Iran systematically supports rebel groups across the Middle East in order to destabilize regimes that do not suit Tehran's dominant ideology. I think this statement is not very successful, and you find it on page 184. Some formatting. I have some comments on formatting. At least in the past, all the tables and charts would be in annex, not in the main text, which is quite loaded with information, or maybe overloaded. And in conclusion, I think my evaluation is positive. It meets all the key requirements established by order on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the applicant deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of political sciences, specialty political problems. I'd like to limit my speech if you... So let's please include your response as a general comments. You have 10 minutes, but can we please stick to the time framework? Our session should not exceed 2 hours. Thank you, Dr. Diakov, for your valuable advice. Thank you for finding the opportunity to analyze my thesis. Dear Dr. Diakov, you pointed at poorly motivated statement that Iraq supports Shiite rebels around the world, but after this phrase on page 188, maybe that was a technical problem, and maybe the page numbering is bad. On page 188, 189 and further, I have given some examples of modern developments, and in the beginning of my thesis, where I tried to prove this statement with historical evidence. Also, as for the technical comment on putting the graphs and tables in the annex, I wanted to emphasize their importance by not putting them in the end, because I wanted to maintain smooth flow and make it more convenient for the reader. Yet maybe I was wrong here. And when there is any, you then making reference to the tables, I think this is. Thank you for your participation. So these were general comments of the applicant. Now let us give the floor to the academic supervisor. Dear colleagues, dear applicant, I will try to be brief. First of all, the applicant came by himself, and he came with his own subject. So what were my options? There are two practices, as I know: either to get fully involved in the process, where in the end the thesis becomes the work of the supervisor, or let the applicant move independently, and this was my approach. I did not interfere very often, and well, this I mostly interfered, mostly chapter one. In the beginning, this chapter was 200 pages long. So I was terrified, I would say, when I saw this first chapter. And my first suggestion was either remove it altogether, which was already mentioned, or maybe make it shorter. two times shorter. The applicant made it 2 times shorter. And then I told him, let's make it shorter again. And in process, many important issues, important facts were omitted. So we could not get rid of this chapter because the applicant insisted, and he advocated his position, and in the end I think he was right. Since in recent years I do lots of practical work in UN, I'd like to say that all the things we discussed here and what the applicant tried to express applies not only to Iraq, such artificial states in Middle East. I'm dealing with Sudan, and this Sudan in many respects is very similar. Starting with UK policy to subnational aspects. I must say that, this is a very interesting issue of American influence, and based on my personal impressions, the British influence in many cases is not secondary, but is very prominent, if not dominant. I'm speaking of the developments of the last week, and I cannot go into details because it's been broadcast. We are online, and in relation to some states in the Middle East, US is more ready for compromise, while UK is not ready for compromise, and they keep emphasizing their role in the foundation of some political formations that we may see in the region. That's all I wanted to say, and especially emphasize that all the drawbacks, I accept responsibility for all the shortcomings, and once again I'd like to emphasize and deepest respect for the applicant who did not duplicate, he didn't copy he didn't follow the instructions of his supervisor blindly. He chose the topic himself, and I have deepest respect to him for this. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dobran Ravin. Next stage is discussion of the council members on whether the degree should be awarded. At this stage, I have to ask our colleagues to stop broadcasting, and I'm also kindly asking all the guests who are not members of the Dissertation Council to leave the room and for a short time, and we will invite you to come back after the discussion is over. Dear colleagues, as is the most important time of our meeting has come. I now put the awarding of academic degree to the open individual vote. And let me remind you that the decision of our council shall be considered positive if more than a half, but not less than 3 members of the council present at the meeting voted for it in accordance with Article 23 of the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. In general, we had our discussion is over, and as is my understanding, most council members, most opinions are positive with some comments, of course. Okay, now let me address Professor Tumanyan. What is your opinion? What is your opinion? What is your assessment? My assessment I expressed in my official feedback. It included many comments. Maybe this was the longest review of all, though these were not all my comments. Yet, taking into account the factors we have already discussed, and considering that the applicant authored his work, this deserves praise, and taken into account that in the future the author will take into account all the comments for his future research. I support my opinion, and I think the degree should be awarded. Thank you, Dr. Tumanyan. Dr. Litvak, what do you think? What is your opinion? I think that we had a good discussion here, and let me remind everybody that the candidate's thesis, this is a qualification work in which is not significant scientific contribution, but his ability to conduct independent research and achieve some results. And I think the applicant accomplished this successfully, regardless of the number of comments. And hopefully his scientific career will continue. So I would like to vote for awarding the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences. And Professor Kivanch Ulusoy.
Thank you very much, Professor. I approve the thesis. I think it corresponds to the basic requirements of a doctoral dissertation. My slight comment will be that if it is published or if it is put online, the theoretical section and the historical section should be closely linked. So it needs to be, the text should be improved. I think you will have for that. So my final comment, I should repeat it. I approve the thesis for doctoral degree.
Thank you, Dr. Kivanch. And in my turn, let me say that the thesis presented here by the applicant deserves being awarded, and in my opinion, as an independent work dedicated to a very relevant subject, not only for the political life in Kurdistan and its relations with the UK, but for the Middle East in general and for the world politics as well. So my opinion is positive, and I think that the degree should be awarded this thesis should be accepted, and will recommend it for publication, which we can discuss in the future, but published after taking into account all the comments. Okay, now let me count the votes. final address of the applicant will be after counting the votes. So do you have any instrument for counting votes? We don't need a computer for counting here. Okay, then let me announce the results. 4 members voted for, no one voted against, and nobody abstained from voting. The decision awarding the academic degree of Candidate of Political Sciences, Specialty 230004, Political Problems of International Relations, Global and Regional Development, to Urper Mehmet has been passed. And the final word of the applicant. In my final address, I'd like to say that naturally, when writing my thesis, I made some mistakes and I ran into challenges and inaccessibility of information, of some sources, of some publications. Of course, I didn't have enough time and maybe enough possibility. My academic supervisor, I would not criticize my supervisor because I was fully independent. I came here on recommendation of a professor who knew me, who introduced me to Dr. Dobran Ravin. So I am very grateful to Dr. Dobran Ravin for his patience, for his input, for his support. He stayed in touch with me always. Thank you very much for this. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, I'd like to thank them. You, dear Dr. Diakov and dear Dr. Litvak, thank you for coming. And Mr. Kivanch came from Turkey. And thank you for coming. Maybe you had another session here, and after the conference you found the time to come here. Thank you so much for this. Dr. Tumanyan, thank you. My deepest respect for what you advised. We will take into consideration. Thank you for your brilliant review. And you spent a lot of time reading my thesis. Thank you for agreeing to come. Thank you, dear guests. Dr. Campbell of Prague, who decided to come and to share his opinion, to share this joy and my excitement, my emotions. Thank you so much for coming. I am very grateful to you. Thank you, Mr. Iqbal Durer of Moscow Linguistic University, who over the years, who supported me during these years. He was always on my side, and he advised me on valuable sources and documents and on the contents of my work. He always supported me. He was with me. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the guests present here. These are special people who, when I needed any kind of support and guidance, they were always on my side. Thank you to my family. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. We congratulate you, dear colleagues. Our meeting is over. The session of the council is over. Thank you for taking part. And please stop broadcasting.